The Scarlet Letter. One idle rainy day, it was my good fortune to make a discovery of some interest. Poking about and burrowing into a pile of heaped-up rubbish in a loft at the custom house of Salem, New England, where I was an officer, I discovered a mysterious package. This package was covered with fine red cloth, much worn and faded. On it there were traces of gold embroidery which, however, was greatly frayed and defaced, so that none or very little of the glitter was left. It had been wrought with wonderful skill, but time and wear and a sacrilegious moth had reduced it to little more than a rag. On careful examination, the embroidery assumed the shape of the capital letter A. Absorbed in the contemplation of the Scarlet Letter, I had neglected to examine a small roll of dingy papers around which it had been twisted. These I now opened, and had the satisfaction of finding an almost complete explanation of the whole affair. A group of bearded men in dark clothes and grey steeple-crowned hats mingled with their womenfolk in front of a wooden edifice, the door of which was heavily timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. The founders of any new colony have invariably recognized that one of their earliest practical necessities is to allot a portion of their virgin soil for a prison house. This edifice was the first prison in Boston, and while never seeming to have known a youthful era, it was only 20 years old. Before this ugly building was a grass plot, much overgrown. This spot in Prison Lane, on this summer morning 2 centuries ago, was filled with a pretty large number of the inhabitants of Boston, all of whose eyes were intently fixed on the iron-clamped oaken door. Among any other population, or at any later period in the history of New England, the grim rigidity of the faces of these good people would have betrayed some awful business in hand. On the particular summer morning when our story begins, the women appeared to take a particular interest in whatever penal infliction might be expected to ensue. The bright morning sun shone on their broad shoulders and well-developed busts, and on round and ruddy cheek that had ripened in the far-off island, and had not yet grown paler or thinner in the atmosphere of New England. "Good wives," said a coarse-featured lady of 50, "I'll tell you a piece of my mind. It would be greatly for the public good if we women had the handling of such malefactresses as this Hester Prynne. Would she be let off with such a sentence as the magistrates have awarded? Harry, I know not. The magistrates are God-fearing gentlemen, but at the very least," added a second matron, "they should have put the brand of a hot iron on Hester Prynne's forehead." "Why do we talk of marks and brands?" cried another, the ugliest of these self-constituted judges. "This woman has brought shame on us all, and ought to die." The jail door was suddenly flung open, and the grim and grisly town beadle emerged. He personified the whole dismal severity of the Puritanic code of law. Stretching forth the official staff, he laid his right hand on the shoulder of the young woman whom he drew forward, until, on the threshold of the prison door, she repelled him by an action marked with natural dignity and force of character, and stepped into the open air of her own free will. She bore in her arms a child, a baby of some 3 months, and it seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her breast, so that she might conceal a token that was fastened to her dress. But wisely judging that one token of her shame would poorly serve to hide another, she then took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush and a smile, looked round her townspeople. On the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, surrounded with elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, there appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done, and with so much gorgeousness of fancy, that it made a fitting decoration to the apparel which she wore, which was of a splendour well beyond the regulations of the colony. The young woman was tall, with a figure of perfect elegance, She had dark and abundant hair, and a beautiful face. She was ladylike, too, after the manner of the feminine gentility of those days, characterized by a certain state and dignity. Preceded by the beadle and followed by a procession of stern-browed men and unkind-looking women, Hester Prynne set out for the place appointed for her punishment. It was no great distance from the prison door to the market-place, where, at the western extremity, a sort of scaffold was erected. It was an instrument of discipline, a public pillory for delinquents. Hester's sentence required her to stand for a certain time upon this platform, to bear the intolerable weight of 1,000 unrelenting eyes, all concentrated on her bosom. She steeled herself to resist the stings of public contempt. Conscious of being the object of universal observation, Hester's attention was suddenly diverted by the recognition of a stranger in the crowd, a man small in stature, with a furrowed brow and remarkably intelligent features. On his arrival in the market-place, and some time before she saw him, this stranger had fixed his eyes on Hester Prynne. Soon, however, his look assumed a writhing horror which twisted itself across his features. His face darkened with some powerful emotion, and when he saw that Hester recognized him, he slowly and calmly raised his finger, making a gesture with it in the air, and then laid it on his lips. In response to an inquiry, a neighbour informed him that the woman on the platform was the wife of an Englishman who had sent her to the colony 2 years in advance of his coming, and the young wife being left to her own misguidance. "Ah," said the stranger with a bitter smile, his eyes on the child in Hester's arms, "I understand. And who is the father of the child?" "In truth, friend," replied the other, "that remains a riddle. Madam Hester absolutely refuses to speak. The magistrates have questioned her in vain. I would venture the guilty party is looking on at this very moment. It irks me, nevertheless, that the partner of her iniquity should not, at the least, be standing on the scaffold with her. But he will be known, cried the stranger, and walked away. "Listen to me, Hester Prynne," called a voice audible to the whole multitude. On the balcony of the meeting-house sat Governor Bellingham with 4 sergeants as a guard of honour. As Hester Prynne lifted her eyes towards him, she grew pale and trembled. The voice which had called to her was that of the famous Reverend John Wilson, the oldest clergyman in Boston. "Hester Prynne," he cried, "I have striven with my brother here." Mr. Wilson laid his hand on the shoulder of a pale young man beside him. "I have sought to persuade this godly youth that he should deal with you, here in the face of heaven and in the hearing of all these people. I am astounded at the vileness and blackness of your sin, but my brother here opposes me. He believes that it wrongs the very nature of a woman to force her to lay open her heart's secret in broad daylight, in the presence of such a great multitude. What do you say now, Brother Dimmesdale? Will it be you or me that shall deal with this poor sinner's soul?" There was a murmur among the dignified and reverend occupants of the balcony, and Governor Bellingham called upon good Master Dimmesdale to exhort this unhappy creature to repent and to confess. The young clergyman, Arthur Dimmesdale, had come from one of the great English universities, bringing with him all the learning of the age to this wild forest land. His eloquence and religious fervour already gave promise of high eminence in his profession. He was a person of very striking aspect, with a white, lofty brow, large, brown, melancholy eyes, and a mouth which expressed nervous sensibility and a vast power of self-restraint. He bent his head in silent prayer, then leaning over the balcony and looking down steadfastly into Hester's eyes, urged her to speak out the name of her fellow sinner and fellow sufferer. "Heaven has granted you a public disgrace, that thereby you may work out a public triumph over the evil within thee and the sorrow without. He that is dearest to you, he has not the courage to grasp this cup for himself, the bitter but wholesome cup that is now presented to your lips." The young pastor's voice expressed such feeling that it caused his sentiments to echo within all the hearts of those gathered near him, and brought to the listeners a mutual feeling of sympathy. "Never," replied Hester Prynne, looking not at Mr. Wilson, but into the deep, troubled eyes of the younger clergyman. "My love is too deeply branded. I cannot erase it. I have determined to endure his agony as well as my own." "Speak, woman," commanded another voice. "Give your child a father's name." "I will not," she replied. "My child must seek a heavenly father, for she shall never know an earthly one." Mr. Dimmesdale took a long, drawn-out breath. Wondrous strength and generosity of a woman's heart. She will not speak. The elder clergyman, who had carefully prepared himself for the occasion, addressed to the multitude a discourse on sin in all its branches, but with continual reference to the ignominious letter. Hester Prynne, meanwhile, kept her place upon the pedestal of shame with eyes glazed, and with an air of weary indifference. The preacher's words thundered remorselessly around her ears. Still with the same hard demeanour, she was led back to prison, and vanished from the public gaze within its iron-clamped portal. After her return to her prison, Hester was in so nervous a state that her jailer asked for a doctor. The doctor turned out to be the stranger whom she had recognized in the crowd, and who desired to be left alone with his patient. He went by the name of Roger Chillingworth. His first concern was to deal with the child, whose cries as she lay writhing on the bed made it necessary to postpone all other business while soothing her. He examined the infant carefully, and then took out a certain medical preparation from a leather case. "Here, woman," he said, "since the child is yours, and obviously does not recognize my voice or appearance as that of her father, administer this draught with your own hand." Hester rejected the medicine offered. "Foolish woman," responded the physician. "The medicine is for the infant's own good. Were it my child, I could do no better." As she still hesitated, he took the infant in his arms and himself administered the draught. It soon proved its efficacy. The little patient's moans subsided, and in a few moments had sunk into a profound slumber. The physician next bestowed his attention on the mother. Satisfied with his investigation, he proceeded to mix another draught. "Drink it. It may be less soothing than a sinless conscience. That I cannot give thee, but it will calm your passion." He presented the cup to Hester. "I have thought of death," she said. "Have even wished for it. Would have prayed for it, were it fitting that someone such as I should pray for anything. Yet if death be in this cup, I bid you think again. See, it is now at my lips." "Drink then," replied he. "Do you know me so little, Hester Prynne? Even if I imagine a scheme of vengeance, what could I do better for my object than to let you live, so that this burning shame may still blaze upon your bosom?" Without further delay, Hester Prynne drained the cup and seated herself on the bed where the child was sleeping. He drew up the only chair in the room and took his own seat beside her. "Hester," said he, "if sages were ever wise, I might have foreseen all this. From the moment when we came down the old church steps together, a married pair, I might have foreseen the damage in that scarlet letter at the end of our path." "You knew," responded Hester, for depressed as she was, she could not endure this last quiet stab at the token of her shame. You know that I was honest with you. I felt no love, nor pretended any. True, replied he. It was my own folly, old and misshapen though I was, to desire a household fire. I have greatly wronged you, murmured Hester. We have wronged each other. Between you and me the scale hangs fairly. But, Hester, the man lives who has wronged us both. Who is he? Don't ask, replied Hester. You shall never know. The eyes of the wrinkled scholar glowed so intensely at her that Hester clasped her hands over her heart, dreading lest he should discover the secret there. You will not reveal his name? None the less, I shall find him out. Your threats make me afraid, replied Hester, bewildered and appalled. I regret only one thing of you, my wife, continued the scholar. Since you have chosen to keep the secret of your love, keep mine likewise. None about here knows me. Do not breathe to any human soul that you once called me husband. Remember, my home is where you are, and where he is. Do not betray me. I will keep your secret as I have his, said Hester. Swear it. And she took an oath. And now, Mistress Prynne, said Roger Chillingworth, I will leave you alone with your infant and the Scarlet Letter. Why do you smile at me? Asked Hester, troubled at the expression in his eyes. Have you enticed me into a bond that will prove the ruin of my soul? Not your soul, he answered, with another smile. No, not yours. Hester Prynne's term of imprisonment was now at an end. She came out into the sunshine, doomed to wear the Scarlet Letter publicly for the rest of her life. Tomorrow would bring its own trial with it. Such would be the symbol at which the preacher and moralist alike would point, the embodiment of woman's frailty and sinful passion. Here, said Hester to herself, had been the scene of her guilt, and so here should be the scene of her earthly punishment. She did not flee. On the outskirts of the town, by the sea, was a thatched cottage, a handsome dwelling, where she established herself with her infant child Pearl, with the permission of the magistrates. A shadow of suspicion immediately attached itself to the spot. Children crept to the gate, watching her plying her needles, and raced away with a strange, contagious fear. Lonely as was Hester's situation, her needlework was her material salvation. The finer productions of her handiwork, first advertised by the Scarlet Letter, were soon in demand for the deep ruffs and gorgeously embroidered gloves required by new dignitaries. But not in a single instance was her skill called upon to embroider the white veil which was to cover the pure blushes of a bride. This exception showed the relentless vigour with which society frowned upon her sin. Her baby robes, for babies then wore robes of state, became the fashion. She had in her nature a rich, voluptuous, oriental characteristic, a taste for the beautiful which, except in the exquisite productions of her needle, found no other expression in her life. In this manner, Hester Prynne came to have a part to perform in the world. In all her contact with society, however, there was nothing that made her feel as if she belonged to it. Every gesture, every word, and even the silence of those with whom she came in contact, implied, and often expressed, that she was banished. She was as much alone as if she inhabited another sphere. It was not an age of delicacy, and her position, though she understood it well and was in little danger of forgetting it, was often brought before her in moments of vivid self-perception, causing new anguish. Hester had schooled herself long and well. She never responded to these attacks save by a flush of her pale cheek. She was patient. A martyr, indeed, but she continued to pray for her enemies. Prynne struggled to believe that no fellow mortal was as guilty as herself. The vulgar had a story about the Scarlet Letter. They averred that the symbol was not just scarlet cloth coloured with an earthly dye, but was red-hot with infernal fire and could be seen to glow whenever Hester Prynne went walking at night. This story seared Hester's heart so deeply that perhaps there was more truth in the rumour than our modern incredulity can be inclined to admit. We have as yet hardly spoken of the infant, that little creature whose innocent life had sprung up by the inscrutable workings of Providence as a lovely and immortal flower from the rank luxuriance of a guilty passion. How strange it seemed to the sad woman as she watched the growth and the beauty that became every day more brilliant, and the intelligence that threw its quivering sunshine over the tiny features of this child. She named the infant Pearl, after something of great price, purchased with all she had, her mother's only treasure. God had given Hester a lovely child, and day after day she watched the child's expanding nature. By its perfect shape, its vigour and its natural dexterity and the use of all its untried limbs, the infant was worthy to have been brought forth in Eden. The child had a native grace which does not always coexist with faultless beauty. Its attire, however simple, always impressed the beholder, as if it were the very garb that precisely became it best. Her nature appeared to possess depth, too, as well as variety. Hester's spirit during that time was personified in Pearl. She could recognize her wild, desperate, defiant moods, the flightiness in her temper, and even some of the very cloud shapes of gloom and despondency that had brooded in her own heart. Hester Prynne, mindful of her own errors and misfortunes, early sought to impose a tender but strict control over the infant that was committed to her charge. But the task was beyond her skill. After testing both smiles and frowns, and proving that neither mode of treatment possessed any calculable influence, Hester was ultimately compelled to stand aside and permit the child to be swayed by her own impulses. Her mother, while Pearl was still an infant, grew to recognize a certain peculiar look of Pearl's that warned her when it would be labour thrown away to insist, persuade, or plead. It was a look so intelligent, yet so perverse, sometimes so malicious, but generally accompanied by a wild flow of spirits that Hester could not help questioning at such moments whether Pearl was a human child. Whenever that look appeared in her wild, bright, deeply black eyes, it invested her with a strange remoteness and intangibility. It was as if she were hovering in the air and might vanish like a glimmering light. Heart-smitten at this bewildering and baffling spell that so often came between herself and her sole treasure, whom had cost her so dear, and who was all she had in the world, Hester sometimes burst into passionate tears. Her only real comfort was when the child lay in the placidity of sleep. Then she was sure of her, and passed the hours of quiet, sad, delicious happiness, until little Pearl awoke. Soon Pearl arrived at an age of social contact, beyond her mother's ever-ready smile and nonsense words. However, this could never really be. Pearl was a born outcast of the infantile world, an imp of evil, emblem and product of sin, who had no right to play among christened infants. Never since her release from prison had Hester met the public gaze without Pearl, who was her constant companion. Pearl saw and gazed intently on the children of the settlement, but never sought to make acquaintance. If spoken to, she would not reply. If the children gathered about her, Pearl would grow positively terrible in her puny wrath, snatching up stones to fling at them with shrill, incoherent exclamations that made her mother tremble. Yet these outbreaks of fierce temper had a kind of value and even comfort for her mother, because there was at least an earnestness in Pearl's mood, instead of the fitful caprice that so often puzzled her in the child's earlier days. Nevertheless, it appalled her to recognize a shadowy reflection of the evil that had existed in herself. One summer's afternoon, Pearl amused herself by gathering handfuls of wild flowers and flinging them one by one towards her mother, dancing up and down like a little elf whenever she hit the Scarlet Letter. Hester sat pale as death, looking sadly into little Pearl's wild eyes. Still came the battery of flowers. At last, her shot being expended, the child stood still and gazed at Hester, with that little laughing image of a fiend peeping out, as her mother so imagined, from the dark abyss of her black eyes. "Child, what are you?" cried the mother. "Oh, I am your little Pearl," answered the child. "You are not my child. You are no Pearl of mine," said the mother, half playfully. She continued, "Tell me, then, what are you, and who sent you hither?" "Tell me, mother," said the child, coming up to Hester. "Do tell me." "Your heavenly Father sent you," answered Hester Prynne. Whether moved only by her normal curiosity or because an evil spirit prompted her, Pearl put up her small forefinger and touched the Scarlet Letter. "He did not send me," she cried emphatically. "I have no heavenly Father." "Hush, Pearl, hush, you must not talk so," answered her mother, suppressing a groan. "He sent us all into this world. Or, if not, you strange and elfish child, where did you come from?" Tell me, repeated Pearl, laughing and capering about the floor. "It is you who must tell me." But Hester could not resolve this question, being herself in a dismal labyrinth of doubt. One day, Hester Prynne went to the mansion of Governor Bellingham with an embroidered pair of gloves. Another important reason impelled Hester to seek an interview with a personage of so much power and activity in the affairs of the settlement. It had reached her ears that there was a plan on the part of some of the leading inhabitants to deprive her of her child. Among those who promoted the design, the governor was said to be one of the most busy. Little Pearl was Hester's only companion. Her mother, in contriving the child's clothing, had allowed the gorgeous tendencies of her imagination their full play, dressing her in a crimson velvet tunic of a peculiar cut, abundantly embroidered with fantasies and flourishes of gold thread. Unfortunately, it was a remarkable attribute of this outfit that it irresistibly and inevitably reminded the beholder of the token which Hester Prynne was doomed to wear. It was the Scarlet Letter in another form, the Scarlet Letter endowed with life. Hester and Pearl reached the governor's house. It had a very cheery aspect, being decorated with fragments of broken glass, cabalistic figures and diagrams. The two were admitted into the entrance hall. The child ran to the bow window at the farther end of the hall and looked at the view of the garden walk, its closely shaven grass bordered with some basic and crude attempt at shrubbery. There were a few rose bushes and a number of apple trees. Pearl, seeing the rose bushes, began to cry for a red rose and would not be pacified. "Hush, child, hush," said her mother earnestly. "Do not cry, little Pearl. I hear voices in the garden. The governor is coming and other gentlemen are with him." A number of persons were seen approaching the house. Pearl let out a scream and then became silent. This was not from any notion of obedience, but because the rapid and lively curiosity of her disposition was excited by the appearance of these new persons. Governor Bellingham, in a loose gown and cap, walked in front and appeared to be showing off his estate and expanding on his projected improvements. The impression made by his figure, rigid and severe to the point of being frostbitten, was hardly in keeping with the ample evidence of worldly enjoyment wherewith he had evidently done his utmost to surround himself. The venerable pastor John Wilson followed him, whose beard, white as drift snow, was to be seen over the governor's shoulder. The old clergyman, minister at the rich bosom of the English church, had a long-established and legitimate taste for all good and comfortable things, and however stern he might show himself in the pulpit, or in his public reproof of such transgressions as that of Hester Prynne, the genial benevolence of his private life had won him warmer affection than was accorded to any of his professional contemporaries. Behind the governor and Mr. Wilson came the other guests, the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale and Roger Chillingworth, a person of great skill in medicine, who for 2 or 3 years past had been a resident in the town. This learned man was the physician as well as friend to the young minister, whose health had suffered severely of late, as a result of his too unreserved self-sacrifice to the labours and duties of his flock. The governor espied Pearl. "What have we here?" he asked, looking with surprise at the scarlet little figure before him. "I profess I have never seen the like since my days of vanity in old King James's time, when it was esteemed a high favour to be admitted to a court masque. But how did such a guest get into my hall?" "Aye, indeed," cried Mr. Wilson. "What little bird of scarlet plumage might this be? Are you a Christian child? Or are you one of those naughty elves and fairies whom we thought to have left behind us with other relics of papistry in merry old England?" "I am my mother's child," answered the scarlet vision, "and my name is Pearl." "But where is this mother of yours?" asked the old minister. "Ah, I see," he added, and turned to Governor Bellingham, whispered, "This is the self-same child of whom we have spoken, and here also is the unhappy mother, Hester Prynne." The governor and his 3 guests stepped into the hall. "Hester Prynne," he said, fixing his naturally stern look on the wearer of the Scarlet Letter, "there has been much discussion concerning you of late. Do you not think it is better for your little one's temporal and eternal welfare that she be taken out of your charge, and clad soberly, and disciplined strictly, and instructed in the truths of heaven and earth? What can you do for the child?" "I can teach my little Pearl what I have learnt from this," answered Hester Prynne, laying her finger on the red token. "Woman, it is thy badge of shame," replied the stern magistrate. "Nevertheless," said the mother calmly, "this badge taught me, it teaches me daily, lessons by reasons of which my child may be better and wiser." The governor asked Master Wilson to examine the child to see if she had a Christian nature, but Pearl, unaccustomed to familiarity by anyone other than her mother, escaped through the open window and stood on the upper step, looking like a wild tropical bird of rich plumage, ready to take flight into the upper air. "This is awful," cried the governor. "Here is a child of 3 years, and she cannot say who made her. Without question, she is equally in the dark as to her soul, its present depravity and its future destiny. We need inquire no further." Hester caught hold of her daughter and confronted the old Puritan magistrate with a fierce expression. "God gave me this child," she cried. "This is my only happiness. You shall not take her. I would die first." By a sudden impulse she turned to the young clergyman, Mr. Dimmesdale. "Speak for me," she cried. "You were my pastor, and know me better than these men. I will not lose the child. Speak for me." At this wild and singular appeal, the young minister at once came forward. He looked more careworn and emaciated than on the occasion of Hester's public ignominy, and whether it was his failing health or another cause, his large, dark eyes expressed a world of pain in their troubled and melancholy depth. "There is truth in what she says," began the minister with a voice sweet and tremulous, but also powerful. "God gave her the child, and gave her an instinctive knowledge of its unique nature and requirements, which no other mortal being can possess. This child comes of its father's guilt and its mother's shame, but has none the less come from the hand of God to work upon her heart, which pleads so earnestly for the right to keep her. The child was meant as a blessing, the one blessing in her life. It was meant, doubtless, as a retribution, too, as a torture, a sting, a pang and ever-recurring agony in the midst of a troubled joy. She recognizes, believe me, the solemn miracle which God hath wrought in the creation of that child. This gift was meant, above all things, to keep the mother's soul alive, and to preserve it from blacker depths of sin into which Satan might otherwise have sought to plunge her. For Hester Prynne's sake, then, and equally for the poor child's sake, let us leave them as Providence has seen fit to place them. "You speak, my friend, with a strange earnestness," said old Roger Chillingworth, smiling at him. Pearl, that wild and flighty little elf, stole softly towards the young minister, and taking his hand in both hers, laid her cheek against it. A caress so tender, and yet so unobtrusive, that her mother, who was looking on, asked herself, "Is that really my Pearl?" Yet she knew that there was love in the child's heart, although it mostly revealed itself in passion, and hardly twice in her lifetime had been softened by such gentleness as now. The minister looked around, laid his hand on the child's head, hesitated an instant, then kissed her brow. The little Pearl laughed and went capering down the hall so airily that old Mr. Wilson questioned whether even her tiptoes touched the floor. "The little baggage hath witchcraft in her, I profess," he murmured to Mr. Dimmesdale. "She needs no old woman's broomstick to fly." "A strange child," remarked Roger Chillingworth. The affair being so satisfactorily concluded, Hester departed with Pearl from the house. Under the appellation of Roger Chillingworth was, we recall, hidden another name. Unknown to everyone but Hester Prynne, but possessing the lock and key of her silence, he had chosen to withdraw his name from the roll of mankind, and abandoning his former ties and interests, to vanish out of life as completely as if he lay at the bottom of the ocean. Thereafter he took up his residence in the Puritan town as Roger Chillingworth, without other introduction than the learning and intelligence of which he possessed more than a common measure. He presented himself as a physician who had lately been released from the hands of Indians in the interior. Skilful men were of rare occurrence in the colony. They seldom, it would appear, partook of the religious zeal that brought other emigrants across the Atlantic. The health of the good town of Boston, so far as medicine had anything to do with it, had up till then been the responsibility of an aged deacon and apothecary. The only surgeon was one who combined the occasional exercise of that noble art with the daily and habitual flourish of a razor. To such a professional body, Roger Chillingworth was a brilliant acquisition. This learned stranger was exemplary as far as the outward forms of a religious life, and soon after his arrival had chosen the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale as his spiritual guide. About this period, the health of Mr. Dimmesdale had evidently begun to fail. Some declared that if this young divine were really going to die, it was because the world was no longer worthy to be trodden by his feet. He himself, on the other hand, with characteristic humility, believed that if Providence should see fit to remove him, it would be because of his own unworthiness to perform even its humblest mission here on earth. With all this difference of opinion as to the cause of his decline, there could be no question of the fact. His form grew emaciated. His voice had a certain quality of decay in it. Roger Chillingworth expressed great alarm at his pastor's state of health, but was anxious to attempt the cure, and if undertaken early, seemed disposed to a favourable result. Mr. Dimmesdale's flock were anxious that he should try the physician's frankly offered skill. The pastor gently repelled their entreaties. "I need no medicine," he insisted. The elder ministers and deacons of Boston dealt with him on the question of his sin in rejecting the aid which Providence was so manifestly holding out. Dimmesdale listened in silence, and finally promised to confer with the physician, and so the mysterious old Roger Chillingworth became the pastor's medical adviser. It was not only the disease that interested the physician. He was also very interested in investigating the character and qualities of his patient. These two men, so different in age, gradually came to spend much time together. Roger Chillingworth scrutinized his patient carefully. both as he saw him in his ordinary life and as he appeared when thrown amidst other moral scenery, the novelty of which might encourage something new to surface in his character. Mr. Chillingworth deemed it essential, it would seem, to thoroughly know the man before attempting to do him good. Few secrets can escape an investigator who has opportunity and license to undertake such a quest, and also has the skill to follow it up. These two cultivated minds discussed every topic of ethics and religion, and of both public and private matters. They talked much on both sides of matters that seemed personal to themselves, and yet no secret, such as the physician fancied must exist there, ever escaped from the minister's consciousness into his companion's ear. After a time the friends lodged in the same house, so that every ebb and flow of the minister's life-tide might pass under the eye of his anxious and attached physician. There was much joy throughout the town when this greatly desirable object was attained. It was held to be the best possible measure for the young clergyman's welfare, better even than marriage. Arthur Dimmesdale had rejected all suggestions of this kind, as if priestly celibacy were one of his articles of church discipline. The two friends lodged with a pious widow of good social rank. On one side of the house the pale clergyman piled up his library, while on the other side old Roger Chillingworth arranged his study and laboratory. The pastor's most discerning friends very reasonably imagined that the hand of Providence had done all this, with the purpose of restoring the young minister to health, although another part of the community had lately begun to take a different view of the relations between Mr. Dimmesdale and the mysterious old physician. Two of these latter individuals hinted that the man of skill, during his Indian captivity, had enlarged his medical attainments by joining in the incantations of the savage priests, who were universally acknowledged to be powerful enchanters, often performing seemingly miraculous cures by their skill in the black art. A large number affirmed that Roger Chillingworth had changed since sharing his residence with Mr. Dimmesdale. At first his expression had been calm, meditative, and scholar-like. Now there was something ugly and evil in his face, which they had not previously noticed, and which grew still more obvious the more they looked at him. It grew to be a widely diffused opinion that the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale was haunted either by Satan himself or Satan's emissary in the guise of Roger Chillingworth. The people expected, with unshaken hope, to see the minister emerge from the conflict transfigured with the glory which he would unquestionably win. Meanwhile, they were saddened to think of the mortal agony through which he must struggle to achieve his triumph. Alas, to judge from the gloom and terror in the depths of the poor minister's eyes, the battle was a sore one, and the victory anything but secure. Throughout his life, old Roger Chillingworth had had a calm temperament. Kindly in all his relations with the world, he was a pure and upright man. He had begun his investigation of Mr. Dimmesdale with the severity and integrity of a judge, desiring only the truth. But as he proceeded, a terrible fascination, a kind of fierce though still calm urgency seized the old man, and its grasp never set him free again until he had done its bidding. He dug into the poor clergyman's heart, like a sexton delving into the grave, seeking for a jewel that had been buried, but knowing he was likely to find nothing but mortality and corruption. The soil where this dark miner was working, by chance, showed indications that encouraged him. This man, he said to himself, pure as they deem him, spiritual as he seems, has inherited a strong animal nature from his father or his mother. Let us dig a little further in this direction. He groped along stealthily, with as cautious a tread and as wary an outlook as a thief entering a room where a man lies only half asleep, with the intention of stealing the very treasure which this man guards. In spite of his premeditated carefulness, the floor would now and then creak. The shadows of his presence would be thrown across his victim. In other words, Mr. Dimmesdale would at times become vaguely aware that something designed to upset his peace was occurring. But old Roger Chillingworth, too, had perceptions that were almost intuitive, and when the minister threw his startled eyes towards him, there the physician sat, his kind, watchful, sympathizing, but never intrusive friend. Yet Mr. Dimmesdale, perhaps in consequence of his sickness, could not recognize his enemy when he actually appeared. He therefore kept up a familiar conversation with the old physician. One day he talked with Roger Chillingworth while the old man was examining a bundle of unsightly plants. "Where," he asked, with a look at them, "my kind doctor, did you gather those herbs with such a dark, flabby leaf?" "In the graveyard near by," answered the physician. "They are new to me. I found them growing on a grave which bore no memorial to the dead man save these ugly weeds. They grew out of his heart, and I fancy typify some hideous secret that was buried with him, and which he might have done better to confess during his lifetime." "That, good sir, is but a fantasy of yours," replied the minister. "There can be no power short of divine mercy that can disclose secrets buried within a human heart. I believe, moreover, that hearts holding such miserable secrets as those of which you speak will yield them up on the last day, not with reluctance, but with an unutterable joy." "Then why not reveal them here on earth?" asked Roger Chillingworth. "They mostly do," replied the clergyman. Many a poor soul hath given its confidence to me, not only on the deathbed, but while strong in life and fair in reputation. And always after such an outpouring, what relief have I witnessed in those sinful brethren! How can it be otherwise? Why should a wretched man, guilty, let us say, of murder, prefer to keep the dead corpse buried in his own heart, rather than fling it forth at once and let the universe take care of it? Yet some men do bury their secrets." "True, there are such men," answered Mr. Dimmesdale. "But it may be that they keep silent as a result of the very constitution of their nature, or they shrink from displaying themselves black and filthy in the view of their fellow men. To their own unutterable torment, they go about their fellow creatures looking pure as new-fallen snow, while their hearts are all speckled and spotted with iniquity of which they cannot rid themselves." "These men deceive themselves," said Roger Chillingworth emphatically. "They fear to feel the shame that rightfully belongs to them." "That may be so," replied the young clergyman indifferently. "But now I would ask of my well-skilled physician whether he deems me to have profited by his kindly care of this weak frame of mine." Before Roger Chillingworth could answer, they heard the clear, wild laughter of a young child's voice. The minister saw Hester Prynne and Pearl passing along the footpath. Pearl looked as beautiful as the day. She skipped irreverently from one grave to another, dancing on the last. "There is no law, nor reverence for authority, nor regard for opinions right or wrong in that child's composition," remarked the physician to his companion. "I saw her the other day bespatter the governor himself with water at the cattle trough in Spring Lane. What in heaven's name is she? Is the imp altogether evil? Has she no principles?" "None, save the freedom of a broken law," answered Mr. Dimmesdale in a quiet way. "Whether she is capable of good, I know not." The child probably overheard their voices, for, looking up to the window with a bright but naughty smile, she snatched up and threw a prickly burr at the reverend. The sensitive clergyman shrunk from the missile. Detecting his emotion, Pearl clapped her little hands in utter ecstasy. Hester Prynne glanced up and saw these three looking at each other in silence, till the child laughed aloud and shouted, "Come away, mother! Come away, or that old black man will catch you! Catch you! But he cannot catch little Pearl!" So she drew her mother away, skipping, dancing, and frisking fantastically among the hillocks of the dead people, like a creature that had nothing in common with a bygone and buried generation, nor considered herself kin to it. "There goes a woman," resumed Roger Chillingworth, "who has made no mystery of the hidden sinfulness which you consider so grievous. Do you think Hester Prynne is any the less miserable as a result of that scarlet letter on her breast?" "I believe so," answered the clergyman. "Nevertheless, I cannot answer for her. There is a look of pain in her face, which I would gladly have been spared the sight of." There was a pause. Then the physician returned to the subject of his young friend's health. "Your disorder is a strange one," he said. "Let me ask you as a friend if every aspect of this disorder has been honestly recounted to me." "How can you question it?" asked the minister. "You are telling me, then, that I know everything?" said Roger Chillingworth. "So be it. Bodily disease, which we look upon as whole and entire within itself, may, after all, be but a symptom of some ailment in the spirit. Your pardon, good sir, if my speech gave the shadow of offence. A sickness, a sore place, may we call it, in your spirit, immediately has its appropriate manifestation in the body. Would you have your physician heal the bodily evil? How may this be, unless you first lay open to him the wound or trouble in your soul?" "No, not to you. Not to an earthly physician," cried Mr. Dimmesdale passionately. "Who are you that meddles in this matter, that dares thrust himself between the sufferer and his God?" With a frantic gesture he rushed out of the room. "It is as well to have taken this step," said Roger Chillingworth to himself. "There is nothing lost by it, for we shall be friends again by and by. See how passion takes hold upon this man. He has done a wild thing before now, this pious Master Dimmesdale, in the hot passion of his heart." The young clergyman, after a few hours of privacy, realized the disorder of his nerves had provoked him into an unseemly outbreak of temper. With a sense of remorse, he lost no time in making the amplest apologies, and asked his friend to continue the case which, if not successful in restoring him to health, had, in all probability, been the means of prolonging his feeble existence to that hour. Roger Chillingworth readily assented, and went on with his medical supervision of the minister, but always leaving his patient's room at the conclusion of the interview with a mysterious and puzzled smile on his lips. "A rare case," he muttered. "I must look deeper into it. It shows a strange sympathy between soul and body. I must get to the bottom of this matter." It came to pass that, not long after, the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale at noonday fell into a deep, deep sleep, sitting in his chair. He did not stir when old Roger Chillingworth, without any extraordinary caution, came into the room. The physician advanced, laid his hand on his patient's chest, and thrust aside the vestment that hitherto had always covered it, even from the professional eye. After a brief pause, the physician turned away with a wild look of wonder, joy, and horror. He threw his arms towards the ceiling and stamped his foot on the floor. After this incident, the conversation between the clergyman and the physician took on a different character. Calm, gentle, passionless as Roger Chillingworth appeared, there was yet in him a quiet depth of malice, hitherto latent but now active, which led him to imagine a more intimate revenge than any mortal had ever wreaked upon an enemy. He became not only a spectator, but a chief actor in the poor minister's interior world. He could play upon him as he chose. The victim was forever on the rack. It needed only to know the spring that controlled the engine. As at the waving of a magician's wand, there arose a grisly phantom, 1,000 phantoms in many shapes, of death, or more often of awful shame, all flocking about the clergyman and pointing with their fingers at his breast. All this was accomplished with a subtlety so perfect that the minister could never know its actual nature. True, he looked doubtfully, fearfully even at times, with horror and the bitterness of hatred at the deformed figure of the old physician. Mr. Dimmesdale took himself to task for his antipathy towards Roger Chillingworth, and did his best to root it out. While suffering bodily disease, and at the same time being tortured by some black trouble of the soul, and given the machinations of his deadliest enemy, the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale had achieved a brilliant popularity in his sacred office. He won it, indeed, in great part, by his sorrows. His fame, though still on its upward slope, already overshadowed the sober reputations of his fellow clergymen, eminent as several of them were. He would have climbed to the highest mountain peaks of faith and sanctity, had not the tendency been thwarted by the burden, whatever it might be, of crime or anguish, beneath which it was his doom to totter. It kept him down on a level with the lowest. He, the man of ethereal attributes, whose voice the angels might have listened to and answered. But it was this very burden that gave him sympathies with the sinful brotherhood of mankind, so that his heart vibrated in unison with theirs, and received their pain into itself, and sent its own throb of pain through 1,000 other hearts in gushes of sad, persuasive eloquence. The people fancied him the mouthpiece of heaven's messages of wisdom, rebuke, and love. In their eyes, the very ground on which he trod was sanctified. It is inconceivable the agony with which this public veneration tortured him. He longed to speak out from his own pulpit and tell the people what he truly was. I, your pastor, whom you so revere and trust, am but a pollution and a lie. More than once Mr. Dimmesdale had gone into the pulpit with a purpose of speaking out. More than once, more than 100 times, he had actually spoken. But how? He had told his hearers that he was altogether vile, the worst of sinners, an abomination, a thing of unimaginable iniquity. Would not the people start up in their seats by a simultaneous impulse and bear him down out of the pulpit which he defiled? Not so, indeed. They heard it all, and did but revere him more. This godly youth, they said amongst themselves, this saint on earth. Alas, if he can discern such sinfulness in his own soul, what horrid spectacle would he behold in yours or mine? The minister well knew, subtle but remorseless hypocrite that he was, the light in which his vague confession would be viewed. He had spoken the very truth, yet had transformed it into the purest falsehood. By the constitution of his nature, he loved the truth, and loathed the lie as few men ever did. Therefore, above all things, he loathed his miserable self. His inward trouble drove him into practices more in accordance with the old corrupted faith of Rome than with the better light of the church in which he had been born and bred. In Mr. Dimmesdale's secret closet, under lock and key, there was a bloody scourge. Often this Protestant and Puritan divine had plied it on his own shoulders. It was his custom, too, to fast rigorously as an act of penance. He kept vigils likewise night after night, sometimes by the most powerful light which he could throw on his own face. During these vigils his brain often reeled, and visions seemed to flit before him. In one sense, they were the truest and most substantial things which the poor minister now dealt with, for the only truth that gave Mr. Dimmesdale a real existence on this earth was the anguish in his innermost soul. On one of those ugly nights, the minister started from his chair. A new thought had struck him. There might be a moment's peace in it. Attiring himself with as much care as if it had been for public worship, and precisely in the same manner, he stole softly down the stairs, unlatched the door, and went out. Mr. Dimmesdale reached the spot where Hester Prynne had lived through her first hour of public ignominy. The same platform or scaffold, black and weather-stained with the storms and sunshine of 7 long years, and foot-worn too with the tread of many culprits who had since ascended it, it remained beneath the balcony of the meeting-house. The minister went up the steps. The town was asleep. There was no chance of discovery. He had been driven by the impulse of remorse which dogged him everywhere, whose companion was that cowardice which invariably drew him back just when the other impulse had hurried him to the verge of disclosure. Poor miserable man! While standing on the scaffold in this vain show of expiation, Mr. Dimmesdale was overcome with a great horror, as if the whole universe were gazing at the scarlet token on his naked breast, tight over his heart. Without any effort of his will or power to restrain himself, he shrieked aloud, an outcry that went pealing through the night, beaten back from one house to another and reverberating from the hills in the background. "It is done," muttered the minister, covering his face with his hands. "The whole town will wake and hurry forth and find me here." But it was not so. The town did not wake. The clergyman uncovered his eyes and looked about him. At one of the bedroom windows of the governor's mansion he saw the old magistrate himself, lamp in hand, with a long white gown enveloping his figure. He looked like a ghost. At another window stood old Mistress Hibbins, the governor's sister. She thrust out her head and looked about her, evidently startled by the cry. Then her lamp vanished and was extinguished. The magistrate, after a wary observation of the darkness, retired from his window. The minister's eyes were soon greeted by a faint, glimmering light which was approaching up the street. As the light grew nearer, the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale beheld, within its illuminated circle, his professional father, as well as highly valued friend, the Reverend Mr. Wilson, through the town. She had become the self-proclaimed Sister of Mercy, and the Scarlet Letter of her shame was the symbol of her calling. Such helpfulness was found in her, so much power to do and power to sympathize, that many people now refused to interpret the scarlet A by its original signification. They said that it meant able. So strong was Hester Prynne with a woman's strength. The rulers and the wise and learned men of the community were longer in acknowledging the influence of Hester's good qualities than the common people. The prejudices which they shared with the latter were strengthened by an iron framework of reasoning which made it far more difficult for them to expel them. Day by day, nevertheless, their sour and rigid wrinkles were relaxing into something which, over years, might grow to an expression approaching benevolence. Individuals in private life, meanwhile, had quite forgiven Hester Prynne for her frailty. The Scarlet Letter now imparted to the wearer a kind of sacredness which enabled her to walk securely amid all peril. Had she had fallen among thieves, it would have kept her safe. The effect of the symbol, or rather of the position in society that was indicated by it, on the mind of Hester Prynne herself, was powerful and peculiar. All the light and grace of her character had been withered by this red-hot brand, and had long ago fallen away, leaving a bare and harsh outline, which might have been repulsive had she possessed friends or companions to be repelled by it. Even the attractiveness of her person had undergone a similar change. It might be partly owing to the studied austerity of her dress, and partly to the lack of demonstration in her manners. It was a sad transformation, too, that her rich and luxuriant hair had either been cut off or was so completely hidden by a cap that not a shining lock of it ever once fell into the sunshine. Some attribute had departed from her, the permanence of which had been essential to keep her a woman. Such is frequently the fate, and such the stern development of the feminine character and person, when the woman has encountered and lived through an experience of particular severity. Much of Hester's present marble coldness was attributable to the manner in which her life had turned, from passion and feeling to thought. It was an age in which the human intellect, newly emancipated, had taken a more active and wider range than for many centuries before. Hester Prynne imbibed the spirit. She assumed a freedom of speculation. It is remarkable that persons who inwardly speculate most boldly often conform most perfectly with the external regulations of society. The thought is sufficient, without investing itself in the flesh and blood of action. So it seemed to be with Hester. But in the education of Pearl, the mother's enthusiasm for thought had something to work itself upon. Providence, in the person of this little girl, had assigned to Hester's charge the germ and blossom of womanhood, to be cherished and developed amid a host of difficulties. Everything was against her. The world was hostile, and the child's own nature had something wrong with it which often impelled Hester to ask, in bitterness of heart, whether it were for ill or good that the poor little creature had been born at all. Indeed, the same dark question often arose in her mind with reference to the whole race of womanhood, a tendency for speculation, though it keeps a woman quiet as it does a man, makes her sad. Hester Prynne, whose heart had lost its regular and healthy throb, wandered without a clue in the dark labyrinth of mind, now turned aside by an insurmountable precipice, now starting back from a deep chasm. There was a wild and ghastly scenery all around her, and nowhere a home and comfort. At times a fearful doubt strove to possess her soul, whether it were not better to send Pearl at once to heaven, and herself go to such futurity as eternal justice should provide. Now, however, her interview with the Reverend Dimmesdale on the night of his vigil had given her a new theme for reflection, and held up to her an object that appeared worthy of any exertion and sacrifice for its attainment. She had witnessed the intense misery beneath which the minister struggled, or, to be more accurate, had ceased to struggle. She saw that he stood on the verge of lunacy. A secret enemy had been continually by his side, in the guise of a friend and helper, and had availed himself of the opportunities thus afforded for tampering with the delicate springs of Mr. Dimmesdale's nature. Hester asked herself whether there had not been a deficiency of truth, courage, and loyalty on her own part in allowing the minister to be put into a position where so much evil was to be expected and nothing good to be hoped. She had made her choice and had chosen, as it now appeared, the more wretched alternative of the two. She determined to redeem her error so far as it might yet be possible. Strengthened by years of hard and solemn trial, she felt herself no longer inadequate to coping with Roger Chillingworth as she had on that night when they had talked together in the prison cell. She had climbed her way since then to a higher point. The old man, on the other hand, had brought himself nearer to her level, or perhaps below it, by the revenge which he had stooped for. Hester Prynne resolved to meet her former husband and do whatever was in her power to rescue Arthur Dimmesdale from the black ruin which had overwhelmed herself. One afternoon she saw the old man out in quest of roots and herbs used to concoct his medicines. Hester bade little Pearl run down to the water's edge, so the child flew away like a bird, and with her small bare white feet went pattering along the moist margin of the sea. Here and there she came to a stop and peeped curiously into a pool left by the retiring tide as a mirror for Pearl to see her face in. Back came the image of a little maid whom Pearl, having no other playmate, invited to take her hand and run a race with her, but the visionary little maid, on her part, beckoned likewise as if to say, "This is a better place. Come into the pool." And Pearl, stepping in mid-leg deep, beheld her own white feet at the bottom, while out at a greater depth came the gleam of a fragmentary smile, floating to and fro in the agitated water. Meanwhile, her mother had accosted the physician. "Why, mistress," the old man commented, "I hear good things of you on all sides. Just last evening a magistrate, a wise and godly man, was speaking of you and whispered that there had been question concerning you in council. It was being debated whether or not your Scarlet Letter might be removed. I can assure you, Hester, I made my request to the worshipful magistrate that it be done forthwith." "It lies not in the pleasure of magistrates to take off this badge," calmly replied Hester. "Were I worthy to be rid of it, it would fall away of its own accord." Meanwhile, Hester had been looking steadily at the old man, and was shocked to discern what a change had been wrought upon him during the past 7 years. It was not so much that he had grown older, for, though the traces of advancing life were visible, he bore his age well and seemed to retain a wily vigour and alertness. But the former look of an intellectual and studious man, calm and quiet, which was what she best remembered in him, had altogether vanished, and had been succeeded by an eager, searching, almost fierce, yet carefully guarded look. There came a glare of red light out of his eyes, as if the old man's soul were on fire, and kept on smouldering duskily within his breast until, by some casual puff of passion, it was blown into a momentary flame. This he repressed as speedily as possible, and strove to look as if nothing of the kind had happened. In a word, old Roger Chillingworth was now a striking example of man's facility of transforming himself into a devil, if he will but undertake the devil's work. The Scarlet Letter burned on Hester's bosom. "What do you see in my face," asked the physician, "that you look at it so earnestly?" "Something that would make me weep, if there were any tears bitter enough for it," answered she. "But let it pass. It is of the other miserable man that I wish to speak." "What of him? Speak freely," cried Roger Chillingworth eagerly. "When we last spoke together," said Hester, 7 years ago, it was your pleasure to extort a promise of secrecy concerning the former relation between yourself and me. As the life and good name of that man were in your hands, there seemed no choice to me but to be silent in accordance with your wish. Yet it was not without heavy misgivings that I bound myself in that way. Something whispered to me that I was betraying my duty in pledging myself to you. Since that day, no man has been as near to him as you. You tread behind his every footstep. You are beside him, sleeping and waking. You search his thoughts. You burrow into and rankle his heart. Your clutch is on his life, and you cause him to die daily a living death, and still he does not know the real you. In allowing this to happen, I have surely betrayed the only man to whom I should have been true. Through the town, she had become the self-proclaimed sister of mercy, and the scarlet letter of her shame was the symbol of her calling. Such helpfulness was found in her, so much power to do and power to sympathize, that many people now refused to interpret the scarlet A by its original signification. They said that it meant able. So strong was Hester Prynne with a woman's strength. The rulers and the wise and learned men of the community were longer in acknowledging the influence of Hester's good qualities than the common people. The prejudices which they shared with the latter were strengthened by an iron framework of reasoning which made it far more difficult for them to expel them. Day by day, nevertheless, their sour and rigid wrinkles were relaxing into something which, over years, might grow to an expression approaching benevolence. Individuals in private life, meanwhile, had quite forgiven Hester Prynne for her frailty. The Scarlet Letter now imparted to the wearer a kind of sacredness which enabled her to walk securely amid all peril. Had she had fallen among thieves, it would have kept her safe. The effect of the symbol, or rather of the position in society that was indicated by it, on the mind of Hester Prynne herself, was powerful and peculiar. All the light and grace of her character had been withered by this red-hot brand, and had long ago fallen away, leaving a bare and harsh outline, which might have been repulsive had she possessed friends or companions to be repelled by it. Even the attractiveness of her person had undergone a similar change. It might be partly owing to the studied austerity of her dress, and partly to the lack of demonstration in her manners. It was a sad transformation, too, that her rich and luxuriant hair had either been cut off or was so completely hidden by a cap that not a shining lock of it ever once fell into the sunshine. Some attribute had departed from her, the permanence of which had been essential to keep her a woman. Such is frequently the fate, and such the stern development of the feminine character and person, when the woman has encountered and lived through an experience of particular severity. Much of Hester's present marble coldness was attributable to the manner in which her life had turned, from passion and feeling to thought. It was an age in which the human intellect, newly emancipated, had taken a more active and wider range than for many centuries before. Hester Prynne imbibed this spirit. She assumed a freedom of speculation. It is remarkable that persons who inwardly speculate most boldly often conform most perfectly with the external regulations of society. The thought is sufficient, without investing itself in the flesh and blood of action. So it seemed to be with Hester. But in the education of Pearl, the mother's enthusiasm for thought had something to work itself upon. Providence, in the person of this little girl, had assigned to Hester's charge the germ and blossom of womanhood, to be cherished and developed amid a host of difficulties. Everything was against her. The world was hostile, and the child's own nature had something wrong with it, which often impelled Hester to ask, in bitterness of heart, whether it were for ill or good that the poor little creature had been born at all. Indeed, the same dark question often arose in her mind with reference to the whole race of womanhood. A tendency for speculation, though it keeps a woman quiet as it does a man, makes her sad. Hester Prynne, whose heart had lost its regular and healthy throb, wandered without a clue in the dark labyrinth of mind, now turned aside by an insurmountable precipice, now starting back from a deep chasm. There was a wild and ghastly scenery all around her, and nowhere a home and comfort. At times a fearful doubt strove to possess her soul, whether it were not better to send Pearl at once to heaven, and herself go to such futurity as eternal justice should provide. Now, however, her interview with the Reverend Dimmesdale on the night of his vigil had given her a new theme for reflection, and held up to her an object that appeared worthy of any exertion and sacrifice for its attainment. She had witnessed the intense misery beneath which the minister struggled, or, to be more accurate, had ceased to struggle. She saw that he stood on the verge of lunacy. A secret enemy had been continually by his side, in the guise of a friend and helper, and had availed himself of the opportunities thus afforded for tampering with the delicate springs of Mr. Dimmesdale's nature. Hester asked herself whether there had not been a deficiency of truth, courage, and loyalty on her own part, in allowing the minister to be put into a position where so much evil was to be expected and nothing good to be hoped. She had made her choice and had chosen, as it now appeared, the more wretched alternative of the two. She determined to redeem her error so far as it might yet be possible. Strengthened by years of hard and solemn trial, she felt herself no longer inadequate to coping with Roger Chillingworth, as she had on that night when they had talked together in the prison cell. She had climbed her way since then to a higher point. The old man, on the other hand, had brought himself nearer to her level, or perhaps below it, by the revenge which he had stooped for. Hester Prynne resolved to meet her former husband and do whatever was in her power to rescue Arthur Dimmesdale from the black ruin which had overwhelmed herself. One afternoon she saw the old man out in quest of roots and herbs used to concoct his medicines. Hester bade little Pearl run down to the water's edge, so the child flew away like a bird, and with her small bare white feet went pattering along the moist margin of the sea. Here and there she came to a stop and peeped curiously into a pool left by the retiring tide as a mirror for Pearl to see her face in. Back came the image of a little maid whom Pearl, having no other playmate, invited to take her hand and run a race with her. But the visionary little maid, on her part, beckoned likewise as if to say, "This is a better place. Come into the pool." And Pearl, stepping in mid-leg deep, beheld her own white feet at the bottom, while out at a greater depth came the gleam of a fragmentary smile, floating to and fro in the agitated water. Meanwhile, her mother had accosted the physician. "Why, mistress," the old man commented, "I hear good things of you on all sides. Just last evening a magistrate, a wise and godly man, was speaking of you and whispered that there had been question concerning you in council. It was being debated whether or not your Scarlet Letter might be removed. I can assure you, Hester, I made my request to the worshipful magistrate that it be done forthwith." "It lies not in the pleasure of magistrates to take off this badge," calmly replied Hester. "Were I worthy to be rid of it, it would fall away of its own accord." Meanwhile, Hester had been looking steadily at the old man, and was shocked to discern what a change had been wrought upon him during the past 7 years. It was not so much that he had grown older, for, though the traces of advancing life were visible, he bore his age well and seemed to retain a wily vigour and alertness. But the former look of an intellectual and studious man, calm and quiet, which was what she best remembered in him, had altogether vanished, and had been succeeded by an eager, searching, almost fierce, yet carefully guarded look. There came a glare of red light out of his eyes, as if the old man's soul were on fire, and kept on smouldering duskily within his breast until, by some casual puff of passion, it was blown into a momentary flame. This he repressed as speedily as possible, and strove to look as if nothing of the kind had happened. In a word, old Roger Chillingworth was now a striking example of man's facility of transforming himself into a devil, if he will but undertake the devil's work. The Scarlet Letter burned on Hester's bosom. "What do you see in my face," asked the physician, "that you look at it so earnestly?" "Something that would make me weep, if there were any tears bitter enough for it," answered she. "But let it pass. It is of the other miserable man that I wish to speak." "What of him? Speak freely," cried Roger Chillingworth eagerly. "When we last spoke together," said Hester, 7 years ago, it was your pleasure to extort a promise of secrecy concerning the former relation between yourself and me. As the life and good name of that man were in your hands, there seemed no choice to me but to be silent in accordance with your wish. Yet it was not without heavy misgivings that I bound myself in that way. Something whispered to me that I was betraying my duty in pledging myself to you. Since that day, no man has been as near to him as you. You tread behind his every footstep. You are beside him, sleeping and waking. You search his thoughts. You burrow into and rankle his heart. Your clutch is on his life, and you cause him to die daily a living death, and still he does not know the real you. In allowing this to happen, I have surely betrayed the only man to whom I should have been true." "What choice had you?" asked Roger Chillingworth. "My finger pointed at this man would have hurled him from his pulpit into a dungeon, and from there to the gallows." "It had been better so," said Hester Prynne. "What evil have I done the man?" asked the physician again. "But for my help, his life would have been burned away in torments within the first 2 years after the perpetration of his crime. For Hester, his spirit lacked the strength that could have borne it up as yours has beneath a burden like your Scarlet Letter. Oh, I could reveal a goodly secret. But enough! What skill I have exhausted on him. That he still breathes and creeps about on earth is all due to me. It would have been better if he had died at once," said Hester Prynne. "True," cried old Roger Chillingworth, letting the lurid fire of his heart blaze out before her eyes. "Better that he died at once. Never did any other mortal suffer what this man has suffered, and all in sight of his worst enemy. He has felt an influence tugging at him like a curse. He knew that no friendly hand was pulling at his heartstrings, and that an eye was looking curiously into him, which sought only evil and found it. but he did not know that the eye and hand were mine. He fancied himself he was in the possession of a fiend, to be tortured with frightful dreams and desperate thoughts, the sting of remorse and the despair of pardon, as a foretaste of what awaits him beyond the grave. Yes, indeed, he was not mistaken, for there was a fiend at his elbow, a mere mortal who once had a human heart, but who has now become a fiend for his special torment. The unfortunate physician, while uttering these words, lifted up his hands with a look of horror. He had never before viewed himself as he did now. "Have you not tortured him enough?" asked Hester, noticing the old man's look. "Has he not paid you all?" "No, no, he has only increased his debt," answered the physician. He subsided into gloom. "Do you remember me, Hester, as I was 9 years ago? Up to that point my life had been made of earnest, studious, thoughtful, quiet years, bestowed faithfully for the increase of my knowledge and for the advancement of human welfare. No life had been more peaceful and innocent than mine. Few lives were so well blessed with benefits. Do you remember me? Was I not kind, just, and constant, if not warm and affectionate? Was I not all this?" "All this and more," said Hester. "And what am I now? A fiend! Who made me so?" "It was myself," cried Hester, shuddering. "It was I, no less than he. Why have you not avenged yourself on me? I have left you to the Scarlet Letter. If that has not avenged me, I can do no more." He laid his finger on it with a smile. "It has avenged you," answered Hester. "I thought so," said the physician. "And now, what can they do to me regarding this man?" "I must reveal your secret," answered Hester firmly. "He must see you in your true character. What the result will be I do not know, but this long debt of confidence due from me to him whose bane and ruin I have been shall at length be paid. Do with him as you will. There is no good for him, no good for me, no good for you. There is no good for little Pearl. There is no path to guide us out of our dismal maze." "Woman, I could pity you," said Roger Chillingworth. "You had great elements. Had you met earlier with a better love than mine, this evil would not have come about. I pity you for the good that has been wasted in your nature." "And I pity you," answered Hester Prynne, "for the hatred that has transformed a wise and just man into a fiend. Will you not purge it out of yourself, and be once more human? If not for his sake, then for your own. Forgive, and leave his further retribution to the power that claims it. There might yet be good for you, since you have been deeply wronged and have the will to pardon. Will you give up that only privilege? Will you reject that pricely benefit?" "Peace, Hester, peace," replied the old man gloomily. "It is not granted me to pardon. My old faith, long forgotten, comes back to me and explains all that we do and all that we suffer. It is our fate. Let the black flower blossom as it may. Now go on your way, and deal as you wish with that man." He waved his hand and returned to his employment. Hester gazed after him a little while. "Be it a sin or not," she said bitterly, "I hate the man." She upbraided herself for the sentiment, but could not overcome or lessen it. She reflected on her marriage. She marvelled how she could ever have been possessed to marry him. She considered it her crime most to be repented of, that she had ever endured and reciprocated the lukewarm grasp of his hand, and suffered the smile of her lips and eyes to mingle and melt in his own. and it seemed a fouler offence committed by Roger Chillingworth than any which had since been done by him, that in the time when her heart knew no better he had persuaded her to fancy herself happy by his side. "Yes, I hate him," Hester repeated more bitterly than before. "He betrayed me. He has done me worse wrong than I did him." The emotions of that brief moment while she stood gazing after the crooked figure of old Roger Chillingworth threw a dark light on Hester's state of mind, revealing much that she might not otherwise have acknowledged. He being gone, she summoned back her child. "Pearl? Little Pearl, where are you?" Pearl, whose activity of spirit never flagged, had been at no loss for amusement while her mother talked with the old gatherer of herbs. Soon finding that either her reflected image or she herself was unreal, she turned elsewhere for a better pastime. She made little boats out of birch bark and freighted them with snail shells and sent out more ventures on the mighty deep than any merchant in New England. Then she took up the white foam that streaked the line of the advancing tide and threw it upon the breeze, scampering after it with winged footsteps to catch the great snowflakes before they fell. Perceiving a flock of beach birds, the naughty child packed up her apron full of pebbles and, creeping from rock to rock after these small sea-fowl, displayed remarkable dexterity in pelting them. One she injured, but then the elf child sighed and gave up her sport, because it grieved her to have done harm to a little being that was as wild as the sea breeze, or as wild as Pearl herself. Her final employment was to gather seaweed and make herself a headdress, and thus assume the aspect of a little mermaid. And a last touch to her mermaid's garb, Pearl took some eelgrass and imitated as best she could on her own bosom the letter A. The child contemplated this device with strange interest. "I wonder if Mother will ask me what it means," thought Pearl. Just then she heard her mother's voice, and fluttering along she appeared before Hester, dancing, laughing, and pointing her finger at the ornament on her bosom. "My little Pearl," said Hester, "the green letter has no meaning. Do you know, child, why your mother wears this letter?" "Truly I do," answered Pearl, looking brightly into her mother's face. "It is for the same reason that the minister keeps his hand over his heart." "And what reason is that?" asked Hester. "I have told you all I know," said Pearl. "Ask the old man whom you were talking with. Maybe he can tell. But, Mother dear, what does this scarlet letter mean? And why do you wear it?" She took her mother's hand and gazed into her eyes with an earnestness that was seldom seen in her wild and capricious character. Now the idea came into Hester's mind that Pearl, with her remarkable perception and acuteness, might have already approached the age when she could be made a friend, and entrusted with as much of her mother's sorrows as could be imparted without irreverence to either parent or child. In the chaos of Pearl's character there might be seen emerging a sturdy pride, which could be disciplined into self-respect. She possessed affections, too, hitherto acrid and disagreeable, as are the richest flavours of unripe fruit. With all these sterling attributes, thought Hester, the evil which she inherited from her mother must be great indeed, if a noble woman did not grow out of this elfish child. Pearl repeated her searching questions. "What shall I say?" Hester thought to herself. "No, if this be the price of the child's sympathy, I cannot pay it." Then she spoke aloud. "Silly Pearl, what questions are these? There are many things in the world that a child must not ask about. What do I know of the minister's heart? And as for the scarlet letter, I wear it for the sake of its gold thread." The child did not see fit to let the matter drop. 2 or 3 times a day Pearl would look up with mischief gleaming in her black eyes. "Mother, what does that scarlet letter mean?" she asked. And the next morning the first indication she gave of being awake was by popping up her head and making that other inquiry which she had so unaccountably connected with her investigations about the scarlet letter. "Mother, Mother, why does the minister keep his hand over his heart? Hold your tongue, naughty child, answered the mother, with an asperity that she had never permitted to herself before. Do not tease me, otherwise I shall shut you into the dark closet. Hester Prynne remained fixed in her resolve to make known to Mr. Dimmesdale, at whatever risk of present pain or future consequences, the true character of the man who had crept into his intimacy. For several days, however, she vainly sought an opportunity of addressing him in some of the meditative walks that she knew he took along the shores of the peninsula or on the wooded hills of the neighbouring country. Partly because she dreaded the secret, and partly because she thought she might have suspicions where none could have been felt, Hester never thought of meeting him in a more private place than beneath the open sky. At last she learned that the Reverend had gone out on a visit and would probably return the next day through the forest. Hester took little Pearl, who was necessarily the companion of all her mother's expeditions, however inconvenient her presence, and set forth. The footpath straggled onward into the primeval forest. This hemmed it in so narrowly and stood so black and dense on either side that to Hester's mind it conjured up the image of the moral wilderness in which she had so long been wandering. The day was cold and dark. A gleam of flickering sunshine could now and then be seen at its solitary play along the path. This flitting cheerfulness was always at the farther extremity of some long vista through the forest. This sportive sunlight withdrew as they approached, and left the spots where it had danced the drearier, because they had hoped to find them bright. "Mother," said little Pearl, "the sunshine does not love you. It runs away and hides itself because it's afraid of something on your bosom. Now see, stand there and let me run and catch it. I am but a child, it will not flee from me, for I wear nothing on my bosom yet." "Nor ever will, my child, I hope," said Hester. "And why not, mother?" asked Pearl. "Run away, child," answered her mother, "and catch the sunshine. It'll soon be gone." Pearl ran forward at a great pace, and as Hester smiled to see it, did actually catch the sunshine, and stood laughing in the midst of it, all brightened by its splendour and scintillating with the vivacity excited by rapid motion. The light lingered about the lonely child as if glad of such a playmate, until the mother had drawn almost near enough to step into the magic circle too. "It'll go now," said Pearl, shaking her head. "See," answered Hester, smiling. "Now I can stretch out my hand and grasp some of it." As she attempted to do so, the sunshine vanished. Or, to judge by Pearl's features, her mother could have fancied that the child had absorbed it into herself. This never-failing vivacity in Pearl's nature impressed Hester. She did not have the disease of sadness. It was certainly a doubtful charm, imparting a hard, metallic lustre to the child's character. She needed a grief that would touch her deeply, and thus make her capable of sympathy. But there was time enough yet for little Pearl. They walked through the wood. They heard, then saw the minister through the trees. "Mother," said the child, "he has his hand over his heart." "Go now, child. You can tease me as you wish another time," cried Hester Prynne, "but do not stray far." The child went away singing. When her elf-like offspring had departed, Hester Prynne made towards the track that led through the forest, but remained under the deep shadow of the trees. She saw the minister advancing along the path alone. He looked haggard and feeble, and betrayed a nerveless despondency in his air, which had never so remarkably characterized him in his walks about the settlement, nor in any other situation where he deemed himself liable to notice. Here it was woefully visible. In this intense seclusion of the forest, which itself would have been a heavy trial to the spirits, there was a listlessness in his gait, as if he saw no reason or desire to take one step farther, but would have been glad, could he be glad of anything, to fling himself down at the root of the nearest tree and lie there for evermore. To Hester's eye the pastor exhibited no symptom of his suffering, except that, as little Pearl had remarked, he had kept his hand over his heart. At length Hester called out hoarsely, "Arthur Dimmesdale?" "Who's there?" answered the minister, throwing his eyes anxiously in the direction of the voice. He instinctively made out a dark form in the grey twilight which the clouded sky and heavy foliage had darkened. He did not know if it was a woman or a shadow. He took a step nearer and discovered the Scarlet Letter. "Hester! Hester Prynne," he said. "Are you alive?" "Even so," she answered, "or as much alive as could be expected these 7 years past. And you, Arthur Dimmesdale, do you still live?" It was no wonder that they questioned one another's actual and bodily existence, and even doubted their own. So strangely did they meet in the dim wood that it was like the first encounter in the world beyond the grave of two spirits who had been intimately connected in their former life, but now stood coldly shuddering in mutual dread. It was with fear that Arthur Dimmesdale held out his hand, chill as death, and touched the cold hand of Hester Prynne. The grasp, cool as it was, took away what was dreariest in the interview. Now they felt themselves, at least, inhabitants of the same sphere. After a while, the minister fixed his eyes on Hester Prynne's. "Hester," he said, "have you found peace?" She smiled drearily, looking down at her bosom. "Have you?" she asked. "None. Nothing but despair," he answered. "What else could I look for, being what I am, and leading such a life as mine? Hester, I am most miserable." "The people revere you," commented Hester, "and surely you accomplish good works among them. Does this not bring you comfort?" "Merely more misery, Hester. Only more misery," answered the clergyman bitterly. "As for the good I appear to do, I have no faith in it. How can a ruined soul like mine help towards the redemption of other souls, or a polluted soul towards their purification? And as for the people's reverence, I would prefer it would turn to scorn and hatred. I have laughed in bitterness and agony of heart at the contrast between what I seem and what I am. And Satan laughs at it." "You wrong yourself," said Hester gently. "You have deeply and sorely repented. Your sin is left behind you in the days long past. Your present life is not less holy than it appears in the people's eyes. Is there no reality in penitence, sealed and witnessed by good works? Should it not bring you peace?" "No, Hester, no," replied the clergyman. "There is no substance in it. Of penitence there has been none. Otherwise I should long ago have thrown off these garments of mock holiness, and have shown myself as they will see me on Judgment Day. Happy are you, Hester, to wear the Scarlet Letter on thy bosom, for mine burns in secret. If I had only an enemy, to whom, when sickened by the praises of all other men, I could take myself each day, then my soul might keep itself alive." Hester Prynne looked into his face, but hesitated to speak. But finally she conquered her fears. "You have long had such an enemy, and you live with him under the same roof." The minister started to his feet. Hester Prynne was now fully aware of the deep injury for which she was responsible to this unhappy man, in permitting him to be at the mercy of someone whose purposes could not have been other than malevolent for so many years. She had no doubt that the continual presence of Roger Chillingworth, the secret poison who, seeing the minister's physical and spiritual infirmities, had turned his opportunities to a cruel purpose. The result on earth could hardly fail to be insanity, and thereafter that of eternal alienation from the good and true. Such was the ruin she had brought the man she once, and still, passionately loved. "Oh, Arthur," she cried, "forgive me. In all things I have striven to be true. Truth was the one virtue which I might have held on to through all extremity, except when your good, your life, your reputation were put in question. Then I consented to a deception. That old man, the physician who they call Roger Chillingworth, he was my husband. Never was there a fiercer or blacker frown than Hester now encountered. For the brief space that it lasted, it was a dark transfiguration. But his character had been so enfeebled by suffering that even its dwindling energies were incapable of more than a temporary struggle. He sank down on the ground and buried his face in his hands. "I might have known it," he murmured. "I did know it. When my heart recoiled at the first sight of him, oh, Hester Prynne, the horrible ugliness of this exposure to the very man that would gloat over it. Woman, woman, you are accountable for this. I cannot forgive you." "You shall forgive me," cried Hester. "Let God punish me, but you shall forgive me." With sudden and desperate tenderness she threw her arms around him. He would have released himself, but he tried in vain to do so. Hester would not let him free. All the world had frowned on her. Heaven likewise had frowned upon her, and yet she had not died. But the frown of this pale, weak, sinful, and sorrow-stricken man was what Hester could not bear. "Will you forgive me?" she repeated over and over again. "I do forgive you, Hester," replied the minister at length, with a deep utterance out of an abyss of sadness, but yet no anger. "May God forgive us both. We are not, Hester, the worst sinners in the world, for there is someone worse than even the polluted priest. That old man's revenge has been blacker than my sin. He has violated in cold blood the sanctity of the human heart." They sat down side by side, hand clasped in hand. Life had never brought them a gloomier hour. The forest was dark around them and creaked with the wind that was passing through it. One solemn old tree groaned dolefully to another, as if telling the sad story of the pair that sat beneath, or to forebode evil to come. Yet the pair lingered. No golden light had ever been so precious as the gloom of this dark forest. Here, seen only by his eyes, the Scarlet Letter need not burn into the bosom of the fallen woman. Here, seen only by her eyes, Arthur Dimmesdale, false to God and man though he might be, was, for the moment, true. He started at the thought that suddenly occurred to him. "Hester," he cried, "Roger Chillingworth knows your intention to reveal his true character. Will he continue, then, to keep our secret? What will be the course of his revenge now?" "There is a strange secrecy in his character," replied Hester thoughtfully, "but it is not likely that he will betray the secret. He will seek other means of revenge. And I, how am I to live breathing the same air as my deadly enemy?" exclaimed the priest. "Think for me, Hester. You are strong. You must no longer live with this man. Your heart must no longer be under his evil eye." "It were far worse than death," replied the minister. "But how to avoid it? What choice remains to me?" "Heaven will show you mercy," responded Hester. "Is the world so small? Does the universe lie within the boundaries of this town? Where does the forest track lead? Backwards towards the town, you say. Yes, but onwards too, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. There you are free. So brief a journey would deliver you from a world where you have been most wretched to one where you may still be happy. Is there not shade enough in all this boundless forest to hide your heart from the gaze of Roger Chillingworth?" "Yes, Hester, but only under the fallen leaves." Then there is the broader pathway of the sea, continued Hester. In our native land, or surely in Germany, in France, in Italy, you would be beyond his power and his knowledge. It cannot be. I am powerless to go. Wretched and sinful as I am, I have had no other thought than to drag on my earthly existence in the sphere where Providence has placed me. I dare not quit my post, though an unfaithful sentinel whose sure reward is death and dishonour when his dreary watch shall come to an end. You have been crushed under the weight of 7 years of misery, replied Hester, fervently resolved to buoy him up with her own energy. Leave this wreck and ruin here where it has happened. Meddle no more with it. Begin anew. The future is full of trial and success. There is happiness to be enjoyed. There is good to be done. Preach, write, act, do anything except to lie down and die. Give up this name of Arthur Dimmesdale and take another without fear or shame. Why should you stay one day longer with the torments that have so gnawed into your life? Up and away! Oh, Hester! Cried Arthur Dimmesdale, in whose eyes a fitful light flashed up and died away. I must die here. There is neither the strength nor the courage left me to venture into the wide, strange, difficult world alone. It was the last expression of the despondency of a broken spirit. You shall not go alone, whispered she. The minister gazed into Hester's face with a look in which hope and joy shone out, indeed, but with fear between them and a kind of horror at her boldness. To this poor pilgrim on his dreary and desert path, faint, sick, miserable, there appeared a glimpse of human affection and sympathy, a new life and a true one, in exchange for the heavy doom he was now experiencing. The clergyman resolved to flee, and not alone. If in these past 7 years, he thought, I could recall one instant of peace and hope, I would yet endure for the sake of one earnest of heaven's mercy. But now, since I am irrevocably doomed, why should I not snatch the solace allowed to the condemned man before his execution? If this is the path to a better life, as Hester would persuade me, I am surely giving up no better prospect by pursuing it. Neither can I any longer live without her companionship, so powerful, so tender. O thou to whom I dare not lift my eyes, wilt thou yet pardon me? You will go? Asked Hester calmly as she met his glance. The decision once made, a glow of strange enjoyment threw its flickering brightness over the trouble of his breast. It was an exhilarating effect upon a prisoner just escaped from the dungeon of his own heart, of breathing the wild, free air of an unredeemed, unchristian, lawless region. His spirit rose with a bound. He wondered aloud, Do I feel joy again? Oh, Hester, you are my better angel. This is already a better life. Why did we not find it sooner? Let us not look back, answered Hester Prynne. The past is gone. See, with this symbol I undo it all, and it is as if it had never been. So speaking, she undid the clasp that fastened the scarlet letter, and taking it off, threw it some distance among the withered leaves. The token fell on the verge of a stream. The stigma gone, Hester heaved a long, deep sigh, in which the burden of shame and anguish departed from her spirit. Oh, exquisite relief! She had not known its weight until she felt the freedom. There played around her mouth and beamed out of her eyes a radiant and tender smile that gushed from the very heart of her womanhood. A crimson flush was glowing on the cheek that had been so long pale. The whole richness of her beauty came back to her with a happiness unknown before. All at once, as with a sudden smile of heaven, the sunshine burst forth into the sombre forest. There was the sympathy of nature with the bliss of these two spirits. Hester looked at the minister with the thrill of another joy. You must know Pearl, she said. Our little Pearl.
You will see her now with new eyes. She's a strange child. I hardly comprehend her, but you will love her dearly, as I do, and will advise me best how to deal with her." The minister spoke uneasily. "I have long shrunk from children because they often show a distrust, a reluctance to be friendly with me. I have even been afraid of little Pearl." "Ah, that is unfortunate," answered the mother. "But she will love you dearly. She is not far off. I will call her. Pearl! Pearl!" Pearl was visible at some distance like a brightly dressed vision, clothed in a sunbeam which fell down upon her through an arch in the boughs. She heard her mother's voice and approached slowly through the trees. "Do you know, Hester," said Arthur Dimmesdale, "that this dear child, always tripping about your side, has caused me many an alarm? I thought what I thought, and how terrible to dread it, that my own features were partly repeated in her face, and so strikingly that the world might see them." "A little longer," answered the mother with a tender smile, "and you need not be afraid to trace whose child she is." It was with a feeling that neither of them had ever before experienced that they sat and watched Pearl's slow advance. In her was visible the tie that united them. She had been offered to the world, these 7 years past, as the living hieroglyphic in which was revealed the secret they so sought to hide, and Pearl was the unity of their being. "Let her see nothing strange, no passion or eagerness in your manner of greeting her," whispered Hester. "Our Pearl is a fitful and fantastic little elf sometimes. She is seldom tolerant of emotion when she does not fully comprehend the why and wherefore, but the child has strong affections." "You cannot think," responded the minister, "how my heart dreads this interview, and yet longs for it. Fear nothing. Pearl may be strange and shy at first, but will soon learn to love you." The child gazed silently at Hester and the clergyman as she stood at the far side of the brook. Hester called her. Pearl, without responding, remained where she stood. Now she fixed her bright, wild eyes on her mother, now on the minister, and now included them both in the same glance, as if to detect and explain to herself the relation which they bore to one another. For some unaccountable reason, as Arthur Dimmesdale felt the child's eyes on him, his hand, with a gesture so habitual as to have become involuntary, stole over his heart. Pearl pointed towards her mother. "You strange child! Why do you not come to me?" exclaimed Hester. Pearl still pointed, and a frown gathered on her brow. "Hurry, Pearl, or I shall be angry with you," cried Hester Prynne. "Leap across the brook, naughty child, and run here. Otherwise I must come to you." But Pearl suddenly burst into a fit of passion, gesticulating wildly. She accompanied this outburst with piercing shrieks. Hester understood and turned again towards Pearl, with a crimson flush on her cheeks, a conscious aside to the clergyman, and then a heavy sigh. "Pearl," she began sadly, "look down at your feet. There, on the other side of the brook." The child turned her eyes to the point indicated, and there lay the Scarlet Letter, close by the edge of the stream. "Bring it here," said Hester. "Come and get it," answered Pearl. "Was there ever such a child?" Hester observed to the minister. She advanced to the bank of the brook, took up the Scarlet Letter, and fastened it on again. Here, once more, was the scarlet misery glittering on the old spot, as if there were a withering spell in the sad letter. The beauty, warmth, and richness of her womanhood departed, like fading sunshine, and a grey shadow seemed to fall across her. When the dreary change was wrought, she extended her hand to Pearl. "Do you know your mother now, child?" she asked. "Now that your mother is sad?" "Yes, now I will," answered the child, bounding across the brook and clasping Hester in her arms. "Now you are indeed my mother, and I am your little Pearl." She kissed her mother and asked, "Why does the minister sit over there?" "He is waiting to welcome you," replied the mother. "He loves you, and loves your mother too." Will you not love him also? Come, he longs to greet you. Will you go back with us, hand in hand, we three together, to the town? Asked Pearl, looking up with acute intelligence into her mother's face. Not now, my dear child, answered Hester, but in days to come he will walk hand in hand with us. We will have a home and fireside of our own. He will teach you things and love you dearly. You will love him. And will he always keep his hand over his heart? Inquired Pearl. Foolish child, what a question, exclaimed Hester. Come and ask his blessing. But Pearl would show no favour to the clergyman. The minister bent forward and kissed Pearl on the brow, whereupon the child broke away from her mother, and running to the brook, stooped over it and bathed her forehead until the unwelcome kiss was quite washed off and diffused through a long lapse of gliding water. She then remained apart, silently watching Hester and the clergyman while they talked together. As the minister departed in advance of Hester Prynne and little Pearl, he threw a backward glance, half expecting that he should discover only the outline of the mother and child, slowly fading into the woods. So great a change in his life could not be regarded as real at once. But there was Hester and Pearl too, lightly dancing now that the intrusive third person was gone, and taking her old place by her mother's side. So the minister had not fallen asleep and dreamed. In order to free his mind of the impression, he recalled the plans which Hester and himself had sketched for their departure. It so happened that a ship lay in the harbour. This vessel had recently arrived from the Spanish Main, and would sail for Bristol within 3 days. Hester Prynne, whose vocation as self-enlisted Sister of Charity had acquainted her with the captain and crew, could take upon herself to secure the passage of 2 individuals and a child with all the secrecy which circumstances rendered more than desirable. The minister asked Hester the precise time at which the vessel might be expected to depart. It would probably be out on the 4th day from the present. That is most fortunate, he had then said to himself, for on the 3rd day from the present he was to preach the election sermon, and such an occasion formed an honourable epoch in the life of the New England clergyman. He could not have chanced upon a more suitable mode and time of terminating his professional career. The excitement of Mr. Dimmesdale's feelings as he returned from the interview with Hester lent him unaccustomed physical energy, and hurried him townward at a rapid pace. He could not but recall how feebly and with what frequent pauses for breath he had toiled over the same ground only 2 days before. As he encountered things familiar, the minister's mind vibrated between 2 ideas. Either he had seen things only in a dream up until then, or he was dreaming now. This phenomenon, in the various shapes which it assumed, although evidenced by no external change, made a single day appear like the passing of years. The minister's own will and Hester's will, and the fate that grew between them, had wrought this transformation. He might have said to the friends who greeted him, "I am not the man for whom you take me. I left him in the forest. Go, seek your minister, and see if his emaciated figure, his heavy pain-wrinkled brow, is not flung down there like a cast-off garment." His friends, no doubt, will still have insisted with him, "But you are the man." But their error would have been their own, not his. In the town, poor Mr. Dimmesdale found himself drawn away from his natural good taste, and still more from his habit of clerical decorum, into crises of principle in encounters with familiar townspeople. Yet he managed to resist the wickedness by which he was tempted, and be carried through to safety. "What is it that haunts me and tempts me?" cried the minister to himself at length, pausing in the street. "Am I mad? Or am I given over utterly to the fiend? Did I make a contract with him in the forest, and sign it with my blood? And does he now summon me to its fulfilment by suggesting the performance of every wickedness which his foul imagination can conceive? The wretched minister, he had made a bargain very like it. Tempted by a dream of happiness, he had yielded himself with deliberate choice, as he had never done before, to what he knew was deadly sin. And the infectious poison of that sin had been rapidly diffused throughout his moral system. It had stupefied all his blessed impulses, and awakened into vivid life the whole brotherhood of bad ones. Scorn, bitterness, unprovoked malignity, gratuitous ridicule of whatever was good and holy, all awoke to tempt, even to frighten him. He went to his house and up to his study. There on the table, with the inky pen beside it, was an unfinished sermon, with a sentence broken in the middle where his thoughts had ceased to gush out upon the page 2 days before. He knew it was he himself who had written this part of the election sermon, but he seemed to stand apart and eye this former self with scornful, pitying, but also with half-envious curiosity. That self was gone. A wiser man had returned out of the forest with a knowledge of hidden mysteries which the simplicity of the former could never have reached. While occupied with these reflections, a knock came at the door, and the minister said, "Come in," not wholly devoid of the idea that he might behold an evil spirit. And so he did. It was old Roger Chillingworth that entered. The minister stood, white and speechless. "Welcome home, Reverend Sir," said the physician. "You look pale, as if the travel through the wilderness had been too much for you. Will not my aid be required to put in you the heart and strength required to preach your election sermon?" "No, I think not," replied the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale. "My journey and the fresh air which I have breathed have done me good, after so long confinement in my study. I think I'll be no more in need of your drugs, my kind physician, good though they may be, and administered by a friendly hand." The physician knew then that in the minister's view he was no longer a trusted friend, but the bitterest enemy. "Would it not be better," said the physician, "to use my skill tonight? Dear sir, we must take pains to make you strong and vigorous for the election discourse. The people look for great things from you, apprehending that in another year they will find their pastor gone." "Yes, to another world," replied the minister. "Heaven grant it be a better one. As to your medication, kind sir, in my present frame of body I do not need it. I can make up for your medicine with my prayers." "A good man's prayers are golden recompense," responded the old man, as he took his leave. Left alone, and having eaten, the minister, flinging the already written pages of the election sermon into the fire, began another, which he wrote with such an impulsive flow of thought and emotion that he fancied himself inspired, and only wondered that heaven should see fit to transmit the grand and solemn music of its oracles through so foul an organ-pipe as he. Leaving that mystery to solve itself or go unsolved forever, he drove his task onward with earnest haste and ecstasy. Night fled away. At last sunrise threw a golden beam into the study and laid it right across the minister's bedazzled eyes. There he was, with the pen still between his fingers and a vast, immeasurable tract of written space behind him. On the public holiday which marked the new governor receiving his office at the hands of the people, Hester Prynne and little Pearl came into the market-place early. Hester's face showed the marble calm which the people were accustomed to behold there. It was a mask, or rather like the frozen clamminess of a dead woman's features, owing this resemblance to the fact that Hester was actually dead, in respect to any claim for sympathy, and had departed out of the world with which she still seemed to mingle. Pearl was decked out with airy gaiety. It would have been impossible to guess that this bright and sunny apparition owed its existence to the lady in gloomy grey beside her. Moreover, she betrayed by her very dance the emotions which none could detect in Hester. Seeing the triumph and freedom before her, the girl asked her mother about the holiday. "But look, mother, how many faces of strange people! There are Indians among them and sailors. What have they come here to do in the market-place?" "They're waiting to see the procession pass," said Hester, "for the governor and the magistrates are to go by, and the ministers and all the great and good people, with music, and the soldiers marching before them." "And will the minister be there?" asked Pearl. "And will he hold out both his hands to me, as when you led me to him by the stream?" "He will be there, child," answered the mother, "but he will not greet you today, nor must you greet him." "What a strange, sad man he is," said the child. In the dark night-time he calls us to him, as when we stood on the scaffold over there, and in the deep forest where only the trees can hear and the strip of sky see it. He talks and kisses my forehead too, but here in the sunny day and among all the people he does not know us, nor must we know him. A strange, sad man he is, with his hand always over his heart. Be quiet, Pearl. You do not understand these things. Do not think about the minister, but look around and see how cheery everybody is today. For today a new man is beginning to rule over them, and so they make merry and rejoice, as if a good and golden year were at last to come to the poor world. It was just as Hester said regarding the jollity that brightened the faces of the people. The reputable citizen, old Roger Chillingworth, was seen to enter the marketplace in close and familiar talk with the commander of the vessel from the Spanish Main. The latter was by far the most showy and gallant figure, so far as clothing went, to be seen anywhere among the multitude. As regards the shipmaster, however, everything was in character, as to a fish his scales. After parting from the physician, the commander of the Bristol-bound ship strolled idly through the marketplace, until, recognizing Hester Prynne, he did not hesitate to address her. "So, mistress," said the mariner, "I must ask the steward make ready one more berth than you bargained for. No fear of scurvy or ship fever on this voyage. What with the ship's surgeon and this other doctor, our only danger will be from drug or pill, as there is a lot of apothecary's stuff aboard which I traded for with a Spanish vessel." "What do you mean?" inquired Hester. "Have you another passenger?" "Do you not know," cried the shipmaster, "that this physician here, Chillingworth, wishes to try my cabin fare with you? Aye, you must have known it, for he tells me he is one of your party, and a close friend of the gentleman you spoke of, he that is in peril from these sour Puritan rulers." "They know each other well, indeed," replied Hester with an air of calm. Nothing further passed between the mariner and Hester Prynne, but at that instant she beheld Roger Chillingworth himself standing in the remotest corner of the marketplace and smiling at her, a smile which conveyed secret and fearful meaning. Before Hester could collect her thoughts and consider what was to be done in this new and startling state of affairs, the sound of military music was heard. It signalled that the procession of magistrates and citizens was on its way to the meeting-house, where the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale was to deliver an election sermon. It was said by those who beheld the young and eminently distinguished divine now, that never since Mr. Dimsdale first set foot on the New England shore had he exhibited such energy as was seen in the gait and air with which he kept his pace in the procession today. There was no feebleness of step, as at other times. His frame was not bent, nor did his hand rest ominously upon his heart. Yet if the clergyman were rightly viewed, his strength seemed not to come from his body. Rather, it appeared spiritual, imparted to him by angelic ministrations, or perhaps his sensitive temperament was invigorated by the loud and piercing music that swelled heavenward, which uplifted him on its ascending wave. Nevertheless, so abstracted were his looks, it might be questioned whether Mr. Dimsdale even heard the music. There was his body, moving onward and with an unaccustomed force, but where was his mind? Far and deep in its own region, busying itself, marshalling a procession of stately thoughts that was soon to issue forth, and so he saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing of what was around him, but the spiritual element took up the feeble frame and carried it along, unconscious of the burden, and converting it to spirit, like itself. Hester Prynne, gazing at the clergyman, felt a dreary influence steal over her, but from where it came she knew not. Perhaps it was because he seemed so remote from her, and utterly beyond her reach. She thought of the forest, where their sad and passionate talk had merged with the melancholy murmur of the brook. How deeply had they known each other then? And was this the man? She hardly knew him now. Her spirit sank with the idea that everything must have been a delusion, and that, vividly as she had dreamed it, there could be no real bond between the clergyman and herself. Pearl either saw and responded to her mother's feelings, or herself felt the remoteness and intangibility that had fallen round the minister.
While the procession passed, the child was uneasy, fluttering up and down like a bird on the point of taking flight. When it had gone by, she looked up into Hester's face. "Mother," said she, "was that the same minister that kissed me by the brook?" "Be silent, little Pearl," whispered the mother. "We must not always talk in the marketplace of what happens to us in the forest." "I could not be sure that it was him. He looked so strange," continued the child. "Otherwise I would have run up to him and asked him to kiss me now in front of all of the people. What would the minister have said, Mother? Would he have clapped his hands over his heart and scowled on me and bid me be gone?" "What should he say, Pearl?" answered Hester, "save that it was no time to kiss, and that kisses are not to be given in the marketplace. It is lucky for you, foolish child, that you did not speak to him." Before long the voice of the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale was heard as he commenced his discourse. An irresistible feeling kept Hester near the spot. She took up her position close beside the scaffold. It was sufficiently close to allow her to hear the whole sermon, in the shape of an indistinct but varied murmur and flow of the minister's very peculiar voice. During all this time, Hester stood statue-like at the foot of the scaffold. If the minister's voice had not kept her there would still have been an inevitable magnetism in that spot, from which she dated the first hour of her life of ignominy. There was a sense within her that her whole life, both before and after, was connected with this spot, as with the one point that gave it unity. Little Pearl, meanwhile, was playing at will about the marketplace. She made the sombre crowd cheerful by her erratic and glistening ray. She had an undulating but often sharp and irregular movement. It indicated the restless vivacity of her spirit, which today was doubly indefatigable in its tiptoe dance, because it was played upon by and vibrated with her mother's disquietude. The Puritans looked on, and if they smiled, were none the less inclined to pronounce the child a demon offspring, from the indescribable charm of beauty and eccentricity that shone through her little figure and sparkled with its activity. The shipmaster was so smitten with Pearl that he attempted to lay hands upon her to snatch a kiss. Finding it impossible to catch her, he took from his hat the gold chain that was twisted about it and threw it to the child. Pearl immediately twisted it round her neck and waist. "Your mother is the woman over there with the Scarlet Letter," said the seaman. "Will you deliver a message to her from me?" "If the message pleases me, I will," answered Pearl. "Then tell her that I spoke again with the humpbacked old doctor, and he wishes to bring his friend, the gentleman, aboard with him. So let your mother have no worries, save for herself and you. Will you tell her this, witch baby?" Pursuing a zigzag course across the marketplace, the child returned to her mother and communicated what the mariner had said. Hester's strong, calm, steadfastly enduring spirit sank on beholding this dark and grim countenance of inevitable doom, which, at the moment when a passage seemed to be opened for the minister and herself out of their labyrinth of misery, showed itself, with an unrelenting smile, right in the midst of their path. The eloquent voice of the minister at length came to a pause. There was a momentary silence. Then ensued a murmur and half-hushed tumult, as if the audience, released from the spell that had transported them into the region of another's mind, were returning to themselves, with all their awe and wonder still heavy on them. In a moment, the crowd gushed out from the doors of the church. Once in the open air, their rapture broke into speech. Through the whole discourse, there had been a certain deep, sad undertone of pathos, which could not be interpreted otherwise than as the natural regret of one soon to pass away. Yes, their minister, whom they so loved, and who so loved them all, had the foreboding of an untimely death upon him, and would soon leave them in tears. This idea of his transitory stay on earth gave final emphasis to the effect which the preacher had produced. It was as if an angel, in his passage to the skies, had shaken his bright wings over the people for an instant and had shed down a shower of golden truths upon them. And so there had come to the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale an epoch of life more brilliant and full of triumph than any previous one, or than any which could come afterwards. As the ranks of military men and civil fathers moved outward and onward from the church, all eyes were turned toward the minister as he was seen to approach among them. The shout of honour died into a murmur, as one section of the crowd after another glimpsed him. How feeble and pale he looked amid all his triumph. The energy, or rather the inspiration which had held him up, was withdrawn, now that it had so faithfully performed its office. The glow which they had just before beheld on his cheek was extinguished. It hardly seemed the face of a man alive, such was its death-like hue. The minister tottered on his path. He came to the well-remembered and weather-darkened scaffold where, long since, Hester had encountered the world's ignominious stare. There stood Hester, holding little Pearl by the hand. And there was the Scarlet Letter on her breast. The minister paused. He turned toward the scaffold and stretched forth his arms. "Hester," said he, "come here. Come, my little Pearl." It was a ghastly look with which he regarded them, but there was something at once tender and strangely triumphant in it. The child flew to him and clasped her arms around his knees. Hester likewise drew near, but paused before she reached him. At this instant old Roger Chillingworth thrust himself through the crowd and caught the minister by the arm. "Madman! Stop! What is your purpose?" whispered he. "Wave back that woman! Cast off this child! All shall be well. Do not blacken your name and perish in dishonour. I can yet save you." "Tempter! I believe you are too late," answered the minister. "With God's help I shall escape you now." He again extended his hand to the woman of the Scarlet Letter. "Hester Prynne," cried he, "in the name of him so terrible and merciful who gives me grace, at this last moment, to do what, for my own heavy sin and miserable agony, I withheld myself from doing 7 years ago, come hither now, and fold your strength about me. Come, Hester, support me up this scaffold." The crowd was in a tumult. They watched the minister approach the scaffold while the little hand of the sin-born child was still clasped in his. Old Roger Chillingworth followed. The minister trembled as he murmured to Hester, "Is not this better than what we dreamed of in the forest?" I don't know, she hurriedly replied. "Better? Yes. So we may both die, and little Pearl die with us." "For you and Pearl, be it as God shall order," said the minister, "and God is merciful. Let me now do the will, which he has made plain to me. For Hester, I am a dying man." Partly supported by Hester Prynne, and holding Pearl's hand, the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale turned to the people, who were appalled, knowing that some deep matter was now to be laid open before them. "People of New England," he cried with a voice that rose above them, high, solemn, and majestic, "you that have loved me, have deemed me holy, behold me, the one sinner of the world. At last I stand upon the spot where, 7 years ago, I should have stood, here with this woman whose arm sustains me. See, the Scarlet Letter which Hester wears. You have all shuddered at it. See how it casts a lurid gleam of awe and horrible repugnance round about her. But there stands in the midst of you someone at whose brand of sin and infamy you have not shuddered." Here the minister threw off all assistance and stepped passionately forward a pace. God's eyes beheld it. The devil knew it well, and fretted it continually with the touch of his burning finger. Now, at my death hour, he stands up before you. He bids you look again at Hester's Scarlet Letter. He tells you it is but the shadow of what he bears on his own breast, and that even this, his own red stigma, is no more than the shadow of what has seared his inmost heart. Behold, a dreadful witness to it. With a convulsive motion he tore away the ministerial band from his breast. It was revealed. For an instant the gaze of the horror-stricken multitude was concentrated on the ghastly miracle,
while the minister stood with a flush of triumph on his face, as one who in the crisis of acutest pain had won a victory. Then down he sank upon the scaffold. Hester partly raised him and supported his head against her bosom. Old Roger Chillingworth knelt down beside him with a blank, dull countenance. "You have escaped me," he repeated. "May God forgive you," said the minister. "You too have deeply sinned." He withdrew his dying eyes from the old man and fixed them on the woman and the child. "My little Pearl," said he feebly. "Dear little Pearl, will you kiss me now?" Pearl kissed his lips. The spell was broken. Her tears fell upon her father's cheek. They were the pledge that she would grow up amid human joy and sorrow, not forever battle with the world, but be a woman in it. "Hester," said the clergyman, "farewell." "Shall we not meet again?" whispered she. "Surely we have ransomed one another with this woe." "Hush, Hester," said he tremulously. "God knows, and he is merciful. He has proved his mercy. Had any of my agonies been avoided, I would have been lost forever. His will be done. Farewell." The final word came with the minister's expiring breath. The multitude broke out in a strange, deep voice of awe and wonder, which could not as yet find utterance save in this murmur that rolled so heavily after the departed spirit. After many days, there was more than one account of what had been witnessed at the scaffold. Most of the spectators testified to having seen, on the breast of the unhappy minister, a scarlet letter, identical to that worn by Hester Prynne, but imprinted in the flesh. There were others who denied that there were any such mark, whatever on the minister's chest, or no more than on a newborn infant's. Immediately after Mr. Dimmesdale's death, all the strength and energy of old Roger Chillingworth seemed to desert him. He positively withered up, shrivelled away, and almost vanished from mortal sight. At the physician's death, which took place within the year, he bequeathed a very considerable amount of property, both here and in England, to little Pearl. So Pearl, the elf child, the demon offspring, became the richest heiress of her day in the New World. Not improbably, this circumstance wrought a very material change in their public estimation. Had mother and child remained where they were, little Pearl, on reaching marriageable age, might have mingled her wild blood with the lineage of the devoutest Puritan among them all. But after the physician's death, the wearer of the Scarlet Letter and Pearl disappeared. For many years, no authentic news of them was received. One afternoon some children were at play by the cottage where Hester Prynne had dwelt, when they saw a tall woman in grey approach the cottage door. She paused at the threshold. Her hesitation was only for an instant, though long enough to display a scarlet letter on her breast. Hester had returned. No one knew with certainty about little Pearl, but throughout the remainder of Hester's life there were indications that the recluse of the Scarlet Letter was the object of love and interest of some inhabitant of another land. In the cottage were articles of comfort and luxury, such as Hester had never cared to use, but which only wealth could have purchased, and affection could have imagined for her. The gossips of the day believed that Pearl was not only alive, but married and happy and mindful of her mother, and that she would most joyfully have entertained that sad and lonely mother at her fireside. In the self-devoted years that made up Hester's life, the Scarlet Letter ceased to be a stigma which attracted the world's scorn and bitterness, and became something to be sorrowed over and looked upon with awe, yet with reverence too. And as Hester Prynne had no selfish ends, people brought all their sorrows and perplexities to her and sought her advice, as one who had herself gone through a mighty trouble. Hester comforted and counselled them as best she could. And after many, many years, a new grave was dug near an old and sunken one in the burial ground, yet with a space between, as if the dust of the two sleepers had no right to mingle. Only one tombstone served for both. On this simple slab of slate there appeared the semblance of an engraved escutcheon. It bore a letter A.